underscore that this project was funded by the Colorado Developmental Disabilities Council. Kudos to the Developmental Disabilities Council for reaching out to their stakeholders in Colorado to really try and capture their preferences and their needs and their thoughts related to intentional community. So I'm really excited for this report and all of the work that was put into it. I also want to say thank you so much to the Inclusive Housing Coalition. They were an fantastic research partner and helped so much with outreach and communications. The researchers from the Autism Housing Network who helped put together the Intentional Communities Matrix, which was important for looking at key insights, and we'll take a look at that in a moment. And I especially want to thank Brian B., who I believe is on this call. He's our self-advocate consultant and was so helpful along the way, as well as Shannon Sullivan, who was our doctoral level researcher, who conducted a very comprehensive literature review. This process was a very long process and very diverse with a lot of different stakeholders. So thank you so much to everyone who participated, those who hosted focus groups, those who shared the word, and those who provided critical insights into the report draft. So to give you just a snapshot of the approach, this is just a presentation with kind of the high level information. The report is quite long and quite comprehensive, and there are links to all of the materials and participant quotes. And so once the report is published, you will be able to take a deeper dive into a lot of this content. So we started with a literature review, looking at national and international perspectives on what is institutional characteristics and what is community living. What are some of those elements that are important to consider? How are others interpreting things like intentional communities elsewhere? We looked at the demographics in Colorado. We really wanted to know who is out there and where do they live. And so we did some county level mapping thanks to the Department of Local Affairs. We then put together an intentional community matrix. So working with the Autism Housing Network, we created a matrix of over 70 properties to kind of understand what are the trends in intentional communities nationwide. We then embarked on our focus groups and on our online materials. And this was key. It was so important that we helped educate individuals that there is a history that has led to where we are today in terms of the emergence of intentional communities, that in the past settings which congregated individuals with IDD, that there is an intentional institutional stigma and bias against them, and that even in the recent times that people have been exploited, living in forms of what was perpetuated as a potential intentional community. So the materials that were provided were quite comprehensive. It was the same information from the focus groups that was presented online. We were also very intentional about including plain language materials for self-advocates who do have an intellectual disability or a cognitive impairment. We wanted to make sure that they had the opportunity to participate independently if desired. And so there were two versions of everything. One that was geared towards individuals who did not have an intellectual disability, and then one that was geared, that was plain language that individuals could use. I was very happy with our representation of self-advocates. We intentionally also created in-person focus groups, knowing that online presentations and surveys are difficult for a lot of individuals with IDD. And so we were very intentional about traveling across the state where there were large population densities in order to offer in-person plain language focus groups. We partnered with day programs and service providers to be able to do this. Community center boards, or what is now called CMAs in Colorado. And so really did a lot of outreach to try and capture the voices of individuals with IDD and their families. We also conducted 3 site visits. And then after conducting those site visits and of course talking to residents, we began to formulate, well, what does this look like in Colorado? What are some of the policy recommendations that can be offered? The data and some of initial policy recommendations was presented to a focus group of housing developers who have already created housing for this population, intentional communities in other areas of the country, in order to get their feedback and their experience having developed for this population. Along the presentation, you'll see some pullout quotes. These are coming directly from either focus group participants or survey responses. So in Colorado, we have been able to identify the State of the States in Developmental Disabilities by the University of Kansas identifies that approximately 95,000 individuals are living with a caregiver. Of those, 21,000 are identified as living with a caregiver over the age of 60. And to give you some reference, that is twice the capacity of Red Rocks Amphitheater. When we look at the utilization rate of those essential long-term support services, in Colorado, there are 2 IDD-specific waivers, and less than 14,000 individuals are accessing either the SLS waiver or the DD waiver. In Colorado, there is a wait list for that comprehensive developmental disabilities waiver. There is not a wait list for the supported living services waiver. Now, I also want to recognize that not all individuals with IDD use waiver services in one of these developmental disability waivers. There are a lot of individuals with IDD who are also using the elderly, blind, or disabled waiver, the EBD waiver, and that is not accounted for in this 13,583 number. But for those who are using an IDD-specific waiver, it's only approximately 15% of the estimated population. When we think about, can this population, even if they can receive services, can they afford housing? It's clearly that they can't. Most individuals, even if they're receiving the maximum supplemental security income, SSI, that's $967 a month. And we only have 4,500 disability-specific vouchers here in Colorado. And that incorporates all the different disability-specific vouchers, so the mainstream vouchers, the non-elderly disabled vouchers, and the 811 vouchers. But we know that those numbers are very conservative. When we look at the CDC rates, prevalence rates for autism, intellectual, and developmental disabilities, there is a much bigger picture. Working with, again, the state demography office, we were able to create multiple maps. These are just 2. And so what we wanted to do was really understand how many individuals potentially are living in the different counties in our state so that those county leaders can begin to think about planning for this population and housing options. For individuals with IDD, especially individuals on the autism spectrum or who do not have an intellectual disability, it is sometimes not possible to be able to receive a waiver because they are not eligible. And so therefore, using these prevalence rates is important because we want to be able to capture the need, not just of those who would be eligible for waiver services, but also those who might not be eligible yet need some sort of supportive housing in order not to fall into homelessness or experience housing insecurity. And so when we consider the populations of individuals with autism, intellectual disability, and developmental disability without overlapping, the CDC provides source info so that it is considering the overlap of co-occurring diagnosis. So without doubling up on those numbers, we could potentially have almost 500,000 individuals living with autism or IDD in our state. That is significantly more than the 95,000 that is projected by the State of the States report. When we look at this population, there has been great efforts in the state of Colorado for employment. supported employment, being able to help people with IDD access employment. And still, with such efforts, there are very few individuals employed. And when they are employed, they're really only averaging about 13 hours a week. And this is when they are supported by the state and working less than $14 an hour. So if you consider that with their SSI payments and doing the deductions, doing the math and doing the deductions based on the earned income, right? Because for every $2 they earn, $1 is going to be taken off of their SSI. That's about an income of $1,400 a month. Our state has a major affordable housing gap. There are over 162,000 units unaccounted for. These are units that would be for individuals that are living that can afford rent of $1,100. So even working, this gap that we see, we would not even be individuals with IDD would not even to be able to afford an $1,100 a month rent payment. It would make them severely cost burdened. Yet we have already 162,000 units that are needed here in Colorado to meet the needs of any population. We are one of the least affordable states in the nation. It's important to understand why this research was necessary. The Colorado DD Council certainly has been part of the disability rights movement for decades, right? We know that before 1980, individuals with IDD were forcefully segregated in order to receive care in large facilities, separated from their community, that they did not even have a choice to be supported in communities until after 1980. And even at that time, it was in group homes, and group homes were very innovative at that time. And things have progressed, policy has progressed to be able to allow individuals to live in their own home, in the community. Of course, this population faces discrimination. Over half of the complaints about housing discrimination is based on disability. And so we come to this place now where Medicaid has evolved. They have instituted the new final regulations to ensure that waivers, home and community-based waivers, are truly being used in home and community settings and not in institutional settings. Yet we also have this emergence of properties, intentional communities that are having a higher density of people with disabilities living in a properties that are being built from the ground up. And so it's important for us to recognize, well, what makes them different than the institutions of the past? And why do people want to live in intentional communities, knowing that in the past, when people were congregated and segregated, that they were cut off from their community? And so this research was really important to really understand what are the drivers behind the desire for living in intentional community. What do people understand as an institutional setting versus choosing to live and self-segregate essentially in a community? And what are some of those guardrails to make sure that intentional communities are not just in compliance with HCBS regulations at the federal level, but that allow individuals to thrive, that their intent is being fulfilled over time, and that they don't turn into institutional settings down the road. And so one of the things that we did in the study was we asked people what were their concerns or their fears across multiple types of settings. And so this chart is not very clear. It is more clear in the report, but we wanted to know, the concern about feeling lonely. In what settings do you have that fear or strong concern? And so it was very interesting to look at the difference between host homes, group homes, and then having support in the existing housing stock versus intentional communities. Overall, participants felt like there was less fear and strong concerns across these domains than other settings. It was also very interesting to see that in certain types of settings, for example, in the existing housing stock, concerns about loneliness, being left out, mate crime, being exploited, were higher than in other domains. And that, group homes, there was a lot, and in host homes, there was a lot more concern concern about losing freedom or control or choices being limited. And so I hope that you take a look at these and really think about we have a long way to go in general because a lot of these concerns are certainly present across any setting. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done in order to address some of these concerns and fears in the future. Wanting to know, what do people believe are institutional characteristics? We asked, we wanted to know what do you feel makes a setting institutional? And the following themes on the left-hand side emerged. Of course, clinical sterile atmosphere, having rigid schedules and limited autonomy, lack of privacy and personal space, very specifically having to share a bedroom, and versus having housemates. A staff-controlled environment, so really from like a top-up type of control, that this is the staff workplace and you're just living in this staff workplace, that it's not really one's home. Group-based depersonalized living, a lot of comments about everyone being treated the same, no matter what their level of support needs are, no matter what their interests are, that it's not individualized long-term support services. Being segregated from the broader community, really in the sense that individuals are not able to access the greater community. So having a gated campus or fenced in property where people are being kept in, right? Versus what we also see, and you'll see in later slides, the desire for a heightened security, not to keep people in, but to keep those with not the best intentions out. And then an overemphasis on safety versus independence. So not allowing individuals to have the dignity of risk, having a lot of in-person surveillance, policies that limit one's personal freedoms and self-direction. So stakeholders shared what they felt was institutional, and then we asked them, how do we prevent settings like intentional communities from becoming institutional? In the presentation, we gave an example of a housing community that residents were promised a home and a job and support, and they got much less than that. They were certainly exploited, and faced lots of abuses that took decades to find out, even though they were part of the greater community, even though the greater community knew who they were and they had neurotypical co-workers, they were still facing a lot of these dehumanizing practices. And so after that, showing them that example, we really wanted to try and understand from stakeholders, how do we prevent these atrocities from happening? How do we prevent settings from becoming institutional? And it was very clear that making sure that individual with disabilities and their families, that their voices are heard, that there are advisory boards, that there are people with disabilities in leadership, and that there's transparency in reporting outcomes. There was a desire for oversight and accountability, and third-party oversight, not just one service provider, but someone outside of one service provider, so that if things were happening with their service provider or their direct support staff, that there was someone that they could go to. It was very important for people to come to the intentional community to look at it, and check out what's going on and make sure that, resident advisory board recommendations were being addressed. It was also very important that the built environment was done with modern amenities, that there were diverse unit sizes, that it wasn't just studios or 4 bedrooms, but that there was a diverse set of unit sizes, that there was common space so that individuals could gather outside of their unit to do things together, and universal design standards. Funding and financing was another recommendation, that we needed to have a better way to cobble together all the silos, and then be able to make things deeply, deeply affordable for this population without having to necessarily roll in one budget for housing and services. People wanted to make sure that there was that resident choices were being honored, and that there weren't limiting policies, and that the people's rights were protected. So who is doing that? How is that being done? People also wanted to know that it was important that there was engagement in the greater community, and that that was being facilitated, that people weren't just stuck in the intentional community and never got out to the greater community, but that there was that fostering of the relationship back and forth. And then there was a lot of concerns about safety, making sure that first responders were aware that people with disabilities lived in this intentional community, and that there was appropriate measures to really help people be able to um, get out in an emergency. It was also really important that property management companies were informed of this population, because there was a lot of concern that property management companies were not treating individuals with disabilities respectfully. So, what were the desires? We asked this question in several ways. So there was open-ended responses both in the surveys and in the focus groups, as well as in more structured questions. So these responses was part of that open-ended question. These were the main 8 themes that came out of the open-ended responses for why people wanted to have intentional communities as a housing option. 93% of participants said that they did want that as an option in the future. Not that that would be the only choice, but that it would be part of a broad array of choices that they can choose from. And so number 1 was social connection and belonging. Number 2 was access to on-site support and supportive amenities. So not just access to one's provider or their PASA, as what it's called in Colorado, but an additional safety net, an additional support network beyond just their individualized long-term support services. The third important thing was safety and security. This is backed up by data that shows that adults with IDD are at high risk of being abused, exploited, even more so than other disability types. Autonomy and independence. This was something that people talked a lot about, that they want to be independent, but with support, almost interdependence versus feeling as if they were alone and without support in another setting. Another important aspect and desire of for future intentional communities was just understanding neurodiversity, that people didn't have to wear a mask where they lived, and that they didn't have to fit the neurotypical or able-bodied mold, and that people just understood. It was very important that people had access to meaningful activities. As you saw, not a lot of people are working, and so what are we doing during the day? You know, having access to meaningful activities and having those things pre-planned, because it does take a lot of executive functioning to, you know, organize what you want to do for the day and figure out exactly what that activity is going to be and deal with transportation. How are you going to get there? Or how are you going to pay for it? And some people don't have that ability either. So the option to be able to have activities planned that they can jump in and out of and voluntarily participate was very important to survey respondents. Cognitively accessible and supportive design. So building from the ground up, thinking about this population. You'll hear in a moment some of the key elements that existing intentional communities that people wanted others to know. And then that this was a property that would be stable and resident centered, that it wasn't about making a profit, it wasn't about you know, turning over units, but that this would be, that intentional communities could be a very stable place that was really focused on trying to ensure resident stability, even though there might be challenges in terms of behavioral challenges or budget challenges in the future, that it was really a resident-centered property. When people were giving a choice of different influencing factors to rank, we asked individuals to rank from, this is not an important thing to you, or this is very important. So this was a Likert scale. It was a ranking scale. These following 10 elements were ranked as very important by over 40% of the individuals who took the surveys. And so when looking at the rankings, affordability was key in terms of one's ability and a driving influential factor in living in an intentional community, making sure that it was affordable, making sure that there was some form of oversight for the community. Having a natural support system, respondents believe that living in an intentional community would allow for greater informal community bonds and relationships, so increasing one's natural support system. Again, having that access to support 24/7 as a safety net. Wanting to live with neighbors who seek neurodiverse relationships. So not just those who, are tolerant, or those who don't complain, but really wanting to live with people who desire to build relationships with one another. Extra security was an important factor. Additional transportation. We know that transportation is a major barrier to community integration and helping people do what they want to do. And so having additional transportation options as a supportive amenity was highly valued. Cognitive accessibility features, again, having things to do, and then prepared meals and group dining was also ranked very high as a desired amenity, and an influential factor in living in an intentional community. So we wanted to go visit some. We wanted to go and talk to residents and understand what was their experience living in intentional community here in Colorado. We visited 3 different properties in Colorado. We visited the Trailhead community located in Littleton, Unity on Park located in Castle Rock, and Boulder Housing Partners 30 Pearl in Boulder. All of these properties are consumer controlled, which means the residents who live there are able to choose their preferred PASA, their service provider, and their service delivery model. They had very different supportive amenities or design features that were incorporated. Not all of them, none of them have 100% individuals with IDD who live there. They all had neurotypical residents as well. And before we went to do these visits, we decided that we wanted to create some form of checklist to identify what are institutional characteristics. So based on the literature review that was done, a checklist was created to measure whether or not the setting it had institutional characteristics that were defined by others. And when we visited these settings, not one of the properties had any institutional characteristics that we had identified, except for one from the literature review. Having a higher density of persons with disabilities was considered an institutional characteristic by some. And so that was the only one that all of the properties, obviously, that was a characteristic that they had, was that there was a higher population of persons with disabilities at the property, and therefore, based on that checklist that we created, was an institutional characteristic. I wanted to offer just some snapshot of quotes. I was very fortunate to be joined by our research partners as well as members of the DD Council who desired to attend, but just being able to have a tour and talk to residents and understand why they wanted to live there, what made it valuable to them. We asked a certain set of questions. All of these are listed in the report, but people were very happy with their choice and desire to live in an intentional community. In particularly, I wanted to mention Izzy. Izzy is a self-advocate. She has Down syndrome. She graduated from college. She's done advocacy work around the world. She has her own coaching business for parents and individuals with Down syndrome. And she said that this place is radically inclusive. It's a different generation. And that was in response to me asking her, saying, some people would say that this is a segregating setting because there's a higher population of people with disabilities who live here. And she said, no, this place is radically inclusive. It's a different generation. So that perspective was pretty important to think about, that that it was a valuable asset to have a higher population of people with disabilities at the property. And so we also wanted to know, what was their feedback for future intentional communities. And they were very open to sharing what some of the important elements to consider in the future would be. Prioritizing resident safety through peer support was very important. We heard stories of them who had friends who lived in other properties that were affordable, where they did not feel safe, where they experienced people wanting to take advantage of them, and that it was very important that they were able to know and felt comfortable around those who live next to them. Food insecurity was a major challenge that I don't believe the properties had accounted for beforehand. Um, in response, they have partnered with food banks and their local grocery stores and helped their residents be able to access SNAP, nutritional assistance program. But food insecurity was a major challenge that was repeated on all of the site visits. Noise was also very concerning, that we need to be a lot more careful in terms of noises. This population sometimes has hypersensitivity to noise, and so being able to hear the sound of those above you or who share a wall with you, and the need for quiet hours came up multiple times. It was important that the properties have a resident advisory council of some sort, a place where residents can provide feedback. That is not required right now in Colorado. It is not a requirement. It is not something that is mandated. It is a voluntary action, but that is a very important element to have that feedback loop of self-advocates and residents. Um, it was very important that there is access to someone 24/7 on site. So whether that's a neighbor who's paid as a resident assistant to be there, or whether it's someone who's hired, or whether it's a PASA office, that in affordable housing properties, and all of the properties that we toured have affordable units and used some form of subsidy to make sure that they were deeply affordable, that property management companies don't understand this population. This was echoed by the report from the Kelsey, who looked into this just recently last year in Denver specifically, that property management companies and the affordable housing industry still has some things to learn about this population and meeting the needs of this population. Addressing housing stability through job changes. This was something that came up, that people have lost their job. And then what happens when they can't afford rent? Do they lose their unit? Ensuring staff have places to park that is free, or a place where they can park temporarily to help their residents be able to bring groceries to their unit. This was a challenge in some areas where they have removed parking requirements for good and for inclusive zoning practices. That's considered a best practice sometimes in the housing development world, but it's certainly not accessible to individuals who have support staff that they rely on. Their support staff shouldn't have to pay for parking in order to support the person that they need to see. Having adequate indoor and outdoor common spaces was really important, and that the residents have control and a say in how those spaces are decorated and how those spaces are used and what is done in those spaces came up. They wanted to, from the beginning, be involved. And so it's so important that people with IDD and their families are involved from the beginning in the pre-development stages, that they are able to give direct feedback, especially since this population is so diverse. And then um, it was clear that the supportive amenities that were on site were, there needs to be a funding source for that. So right now it's either being fundraised for by a not-for-profit, by a PASA, or fees are being paid. And so that we don't have a good funding source for these additional amenities that are not long-term support services, that are not those individualized waiver supports, but that the extras, the organizing planned activities, the doing the cooking classes, the helping facilitate relationships in the greater community, additional transportation, all of those things, there's not a good funding source for supportive housing for operating the supports in intentional community at the moment. Looking at kind of what's happening nationwide and trying to understand some trends. Again, we looked at a matrix of 70 intentional communities from the Autism Housing Network. Only 21% of intentional communities are affordable. Over half residents are using waivers. In multifamily properties, majority is what is considered intentional communities, but there are properties, about a quarter, that are scattered site. So a large community is an example of an intentional community where there might be multiple people who live together in a larger home, in a single home. So it's not a multifamily property, but it's using one home and having people live together in intentional community. When we looked at how many neuro-inclusive design features or amenities that the property offered, there was an average of 7 across the 70 properties. And then when we looked at the supportive amenities, there was an average of 6 supportive amenities. 64% of the properties said that they had at least one resident that has 24/7 support needs. And then when we asked about the property's relationships to long-term support services, nearly half were consumer controlled, predominantly consumer controlled. 29% were provider controlled, which means the service provider and the housing were inextricably tied. And then 23% it was a hybrid. So there may have been some provider controlled units as part of the development, and then the rest of the units are consumer controlled. I want to underscore that this type of research and looking across properties across the country would not be possible without using the A Place in the World universal language. If you haven't already taken a look at this, we just published version 3 of A Place in the World. It includes a market guide of 20 different properties across the country. And it's because of this foundational language that we're able to do this type of research now, that I'm able to pull these type of things and identify the number of supportive amenities or the number of design features, because we have that shared language now. So pretty exciting. If you don't know about A Place in the World, please check it out. So we wanted to know affordable housing development. Not a lot of intentional communities are affordable. I put a call out to those that I know that have created affordable neuro-inclusive properties. And we have a focus group that represented developers from 15 different states, which was excellent. Some of the barriers that they face in their state, we do not face in Colorado. Fortunately, Colorado has not created any additional layers beyond the federal final rule. So we don't have any density limits or anything like that. And we don't have any rules around if a service provider could provide services to a property that is considered a neuro-inclusive property. But there were certainly several things that were very clear, that were big challenges in terms of using the existing affordable housing funding streams out there. And so when looking at these programs that were not designed for people with IDD, right? They were designed for seniors or those experiencing chronic homelessness or domestic violence survivors. We're having to work within that system. And for this population, it's not always working. There are no incentives for developers to create neuro-inclusive properties or incorporate supportive amenities necessarily for individuals with IDD. There are major constraints among who is choosing who can live at properties that use affordable housing subsidies and income sources. That sometimes it's a lottery, that it has to be that people cannot be identified. It has to be a third party. So there are some major challenges around tenant selection, which is both on the disability side as well as the neurotypical side, for when there are neurotypical residents in an intentional community that uses affordable housing funding streams. there are major funding gaps. This is a deeply, deeply low income population that needs very deep affordability in their rents and housing costs. And the programs that exist are based on what's called the area median income, which changes depending on where you are. That doesn't change for individuals with IDD. And so in some areas, what is considered affordable with a capital A, because it is meeting the needs of someone with 50% of the area median income, that could be somebody who's making $70,000. So what is used as a gauge for affordability just does not connect with the IDD population, as we need deeply affordable rents. There are a lot of compliance challenges and making sure that those who are living are continuing to be eligible. For individuals with IDD, filling out forms, organizing budgets the way that's necessary. Um, the the paperwork that's inaccessible is a major challenge for these properties. The compliance barriers due to the inaccessibility of how the system essentially works. And then a lot of these properties are not meeting the needs of individuals with high support needs. So those who have maybe profound autism or complex medical support needs, where there could be additional larger drains that are needed in bathrooms, or track systems in the ceilings, or for individuals with profound autism, there might be a lot of echolalia or jumping or stimming that could disturb neighbors. So having shared walls is not an option for some individuals who have higher support needs. And then last but not least, there is a risk aversion with the interpretation of how the HCBS settings rules are coming out. You know, what is institutional? The federal guidelines do not talk about what is institutional. They just say this is what is compliant. And so there's this kind of this gray area on what is a setting that is isolating, or what is a setting that is segregating, or what is a setting that is institutional. And states are having to figure out how they're going to organize and be compliant in order to not risk their matching dollars. This is a very real concern with our Medicaid authorities, because you want to ensure that you're going to be able to secure those matching funds. And so there is still concern, having a higher density of persons, is that an institutional characteristic, and should we have regulations that limit the amount of people with disabilities who live in a setting? So we asked. We wanted to know. We asked participants very specifically, should there be a maximum number of people with IDD who live in an intentional community? And overwhelmingly, um, the what is typically interpreted is a maximum of 25%. So there are federal funding streams, for example, the 811 program, that has a maximum density of set aside units in a property is 25%, no more. If you do more than that, then it's no longer integrated. So is this something that Colorado should be considering as a metric for integration? And Coloradans were very clear, no, they're not interested in the 25% density. Only 15% of participants felt like that should be used. An additional 22% said maybe a maximum of 50% adults with IDD. But the majority of respondents did not want a limitation, and they wanted to be able to have the option for a majority of units to be for adults with IDD. Now, this was not a clean-cut response. There was a lot of conversation generated both in the online surveys and in the in-person focus groups about this. And really, what it came down to was that a number metric was not sufficient for the outcomes that people were seeking. And so offering a little bit more color to this conversation, we created some themes in what we saw in these responses, because we had hundreds of open-ended responses to code for. And so Surprisingly, there were some people who actually felt as if having neurotypical or able-bodied individuals living in the community would increase their risk of exploitation. And so they preferred 100% people with disabilities to live in a setting to protect against predatory relationships. And what we see in the disability community, in the disability rights movement, often is the opposite. That it's important to have neurotypical able-bodied people as part of a community in order to protect against um, abuse and exploitation. It was there were a lot of conversations about, well, we don't know exactly the percentage, but it's important to have neighbors who can provide informal support, friendship, and help in a emergency situation. And so there was a desire for neurotypical or able-bodied individuals to live at a property, but not necessarily a clear cut of, well, should there be a percentage? Um, there was a discussion about having the specific number would be viewed on as discrimination or infringing upon one's personal freedoms or choice to live with others with disabilities. There was also some individuals who said that there should be a minimum percentage. So instead of a maximum percentage of 25%, for example, having a minimum percentage if a property is going to be using federal or state funding subsidies for a property to be affordable, that there was a minimum amount of people with disabilities that would be able to be served by the property. There was also a lot of talk about, well, there's a need for seniors and there's a need for families, that families would want to live in intentional communities, not necessarily that their loved one needs to move away, right? But that maybe as a unit they could live there and age together and access support as needed as the family ages. And so a lot of conversation and feedback around using a density limit as a measure for integration or thwarting institutional characteristics. The report goes into a lot of detail on what are other states doing. And so other states have done several things that I think Colorado can learn from. In Colorado, I mean, in California, they are required, every city and county housing element is required to specifically understand the housing needs of individuals with developmental disabilities. Um, Other states like Florida, Indiana, and Pennsylvania have used their low-income housing tax credit allocations. They have garnered a certain amount of that so that they know in every funding round, X amount of millions of dollars will go towards a project. So at least a project is coming up that it is a smaller competitive pool for neuro-inclusive properties. And so we know that we're generating neuro-inclusive properties year after year. Other New York is a great example of a Medicaid and housing partnership. So their developmental disability agency over there, it's called OPWDD. Here in Colorado, it's called HCPF, Healthcare Policy and Financing. Their disability agency actually provides housing developers rental subsidies, funding for supportive amenities, and even capital if they agree to set aside units for people with IDD. So that would be the Medicaid Authority really partnering with the housing element to be able to infuse that capital needed for those supportive amenities, those deep affordability in terms of rent subsidies, and even capital to get the project going. And then New Jersey has a similar program, a rental subsidy program, but they also partner with their Medicaid authority in order to pre-approve properties. So a property can go to their developmental disability agency, and they actually do a community integration review and say, we've looked at what your plans are, what your supportive amenities are going to be, your location, what you anticipate in terms of the population you serve. And yes, this looks like you meet our standards for community integration. So pretty exciting. It was clear through the research that having a neuro-inclusive housing funding stream would be extremely valuable here in Colorado. By doing so, we would be able to offer some additional guardrails right? So if we were to create some form of funding stream, we could say, well, if you're going to use this pot of money, you need to have this many neuro-inclusive design standards. You have to include individuals with IDD and their families as part of the pre-development process. You have to allow for, there should be some additional funding to be able to create those common spaces and have them covered as part of the distribution of subsidies. There should be a plan, what is the plan for your residents? So there's a lot of things that can be built in if we were to create some form of funding stream from the ground up. Looking at what kind of options, if Colorado decided to advocate for some form of funding stream that could include those kind of guardrails as well as incentives. In the report, there's a lot of detail in this, but essentially there's a few different mechanisms for being able to do that, either through a state housing tax credit, social impact bonds, gardening, a set aside of the Housing Trust Fund. Washington has an IDD housing fund within their state housing trust fund. Creating state-funded project-based vouchers, or even just having a state appropriation for the development of neuro-inclusive housing. So there's several different paths that can be advocated for, and certainly more work is needed to talk to the powers that be and figure out what would be the most effective option. And so we offer a few recommendations in the report, pretty direct, that it's important that we're using outcome-oriented standards and transparent evaluation tools versus just density limits, right? It's not about checking a box. It's really about how are people's lives being impacted by where they live, and are their rights being protected? We concluded that intentional community should remain consumer controlled, yet allow service providers to be able to own and operate properties as well. So individuals have the choice to use a different service provider, but we're not restricting providers from partnering with affordable housing developers to develop more affordable housing options. We recommend requiring resident advisory boards with third-party on-site reviews of intentional communities in the future. And that Colorado should develop some form of housing plan to ensure that people are not reinstitutionalized because of lack of housing. If you haven't heard, there is a community integration plan that's required because of recent recent bills that were approved. And so maybe this is something that we really need to be advocating, that part of that community integration plan is really looking at housing and how are we going to meet the needs so people do not become reinstitutionalized. Again, a big recommendation is to create some form of new funding source to increase neuro-inclusive housing options, but as well as leveraging those existing funding streams. So like Florida and Indiana and Pennsylvania and Washington, those existing affordable housing funding streams that are there, how can we prioritize this population or incentivize so that more of that money is being geared towards solutions targeting individuals with IDD? We also recommended that there is a campaign within the public and the philanthropic community to help them understand the need to cover supportive amenities, that having individualized long-term support services through waivers is very important, and we need to continue to advocate for more waiver services and funding levels, but that for those who are ineligible for waivers, who are at high risk of displacement into institutional settings or homelessness, that there needs to be a safety net, and supportive amenities could be that safety net. And then making sure that the recommendations that again are in this recent legislation that from the Task Force on the Rights of Coloradans with Disabilities, that we echo those recommendations as they are certainly needed and was very thoroughly thought out. So that is it. We're excited to share with you the report in the future. It is not yet published. We are still working on some finishing touches, but this is certainly a quick little snapshot. And feel free to email me any questions. Again, thank you so much to my research partners and the Colorado DD Council for funding this very, very important work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Desiree. That was terrific. We have just a couple of minutes left for some questions and answers, so I will go ahead. I've been monitoring the chat, but just uh, uh, a couple of ones that are sort of overarching here is number one, when do you think the report will be available, and where's a good place to be able to locate that?
Sign up for our newsletters from the Inclusive Housing Coalition or the Colorado DD Council, as they will be announcing it, or on the Autism Housing Network. And I'm unsure when it will be publicly available.
Excellent. And then in the chat, one of the overarching questions we're sort of getting is, what about where are there intentional housing communities potentially in my state? And so, is there a national sort of resource that is available for folks to visit that might be helpful? That
Yep, I would say one of the first steps is going to the Autism Housing Network. There is a housing directory that has almost 200 properties across the country. So please check out the Autism Housing Network. And then the other thing, while you're on the Autism Housing Network, check out the A Place in the World report. There is a housing market guide that also features several properties across the country.
great. And speaking of the A Place in the World report, someone was wondering when that new report might be available and where it might be available.
It is available. You can go to the Autism Housing Network and go to Learn or on the homepage, and it is currently uploaded and published. So it is currently available.
Great. There's a little bit of a side conversation going on within the chat, so I invite people to keep doing that. But what I'm going to do here for the next just a couple of minutes is invite people to raise their hand, which that's the raise your hand function is at the React under the React button, and raise your hand, and I will call on you and ask you to come off mute, and you can ask Desiree a question. Okay. With that, I'm not really seeing anybody coming off mute to ask a question. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and say thank you very much to Desiree for all of this super important information. She gave you her contact information to be able to. Oh, I guess we do have one question. I'm sorry, I spoke too soon. Go ahead, Miriam. Perhaps.
Like I appreciate your presentation. It's very really like enlightening. I have myself a big boy right now that he's off of school. He's 22, and then I was in the middle of setting up like a kind of the same thing, the inclusive like a community. However, in North Carolina, you have to do a lot of when you're talking about intentional community, are you is it the same process like going through the licensings with the state, with the like human services and everything? Or is it like a different? Because when you're talking about some people that are new diversion there, and then other uh, individual that have like my son severe autism. So is the process is the same when you're talking about intentional communities?
So every state actually is very different in terms of what is possible based on regulations. Most intentional communities are actually not licensed. So they are not
Okay.
considered provider controlled. They are not licensed. People who live there can use their waiver funding to receive services at the setting, but there isn't necessarily they're not necessarily licensed to
Okay.
so, but every state's a little bit different. So, if an individual has high support needs, there are still states where an individual with high support needs cannot live in their own home. The budgets don't allow it. They are forced to live in a provider controlled setting, and in which case it is um, important to advocate that either the state allows the individual to get the budgets needed to live in their own home and receive services and change their provider as needed, or that if you want to create a community that is serving that population, that you're allowed to do so with a provider controlled setting. So it depends.
So when you're talking about intentional, does the word intentional communities means a lot in between differentiate between if you have to go through the hassle of licensing or not? When for example, I have already the place that I've been really dealing with the nonsense like here, and it's a huge place. I have 9 bedrooms, I have 2 big kitchen, I have 4 full bed, but it has been really like a hassle to get because the differences between like having like a place where you can have it was like a question of zoning if it's going to be really like a multi-family or not, and thank you God it has been really like kind of granted the changes for in my and for my really like kind of my I don't know the word in English. Like we know, I was lucky because they really like changed the zoning. However, right now, if tomorrow I like what I heard today and I wanted to go and do so, how should I approach my clients, my people? Like for example, okay, well, like I can just say like go to the that network, like autism network, or I can just say, okay, well, you know what? How do you approach those people that may have out of pocket, or maybe they have the already like what we call here, it's a
Okay, yep,
innovation.
I understand. So if you have a solution and you want to just spread word, you could submit a listing on the Autism Housing Network. It doesn't cost anything, and properties don't even have to be existing. They could still be in planning stages. That's okay, to try and share the word. You could also just do the communicating with your DD council or other advocacy organizations to try and spread the word. In terms of like policy issues, you do have to be careful because you have the policy barriers oftentimes on the Medicaid side for services, but there are local barriers as well. I'm from Miami, Florida, and more than 3 women in a home is not allowed, even on college campuses, because it's considered a brothel. And so you can't have more than 3 women, and that's a zoning thing that has nothing to do with disability. It's just a local zoning challenge. So everyone who is looking at developing, some form of multifamily intentional community, it's really important to look both on the Medicaid side in terms of the regulatory climate as well as on the local zoning side. Miriam, if you have additional questions, feel free to reach out either through the Autism Housing Network or my email is at the end of the presentation, and I'd be happy to discuss further.
Thank you so much,
Anybody else?
Desiree. We are a little bit over time here, so we're going to go ahead and adjourn for today. But thank you very much for joining us today. This presentation will be available on the IHC website probably next week. You have Desiree's contact information. And thanks, everybody, and have a great day.